Brad, in your wildest dreams, did you ever think that you'd get to sit on my stage 2 years in a row?
I mean, clearly it's a mistake. Although, it's interesting. A lot has changed. No boxing gloves. Yep. Thanks to Stu's legal maneuvering, a critical victory for the whole crypto industry. So it's good to be back. And we're, I think, made a lot of progress in the last year as an industry.
So we'll talk a little bit about outside of the court cases, what you guys have going on, but I think we'd be remiss if we don't talk about the biggest story for you this year. I'd argue, one of the top 3 biggest stories of the year for crypto in general. Just last year we talked about this on stage, why you guys were fighting, why you guys were taking it to the end, and even back then I think it was uncertain if you were ultimately going to reach a settlement, right? These things always kind of build to the 11th hour, and then at the last minute, there's usually some resolution. That's 99 times out of 100, that's how these cases work. You guys took it to the finish line. I made the comment that it was a split decision. I know you're going to dispute that, but why don't we just talk about the last 6 months in particular, taking this all the way to the finish line, what you think the outcome means.
You can't say it was a split decision, not let us comment on that.
No, the floor is, I said I know you're going to disagree with me on that, but that's fine. But yeah, I want to, what I'm most interested in is like the last few months, like in this process where you made the decision to we just feel confident in our position and we're going to let the court decide.
Well, so look, I think what's clear, and Stu is truly has been the instrumental mastermind behind this, and so I'll let him comment on this. But there's no question that this was a victory, like a big victory.
Yes.
Everything the SEC cares about, they lost.
Yes.
A freight train was driven through Gensler's argument that all these are securities. Well, now we very clearly have a federal judge saying XRP is not a security. And look, I know we've talked about this, but I'll remind people, when we first got sued, which was almost 3 years ago, a lot in the industry were like, oh, Ripple's different, XRP's different. And we said at the time, like, this is an attack on the whole industry.
Yep.
And I think we finally have come around to realize that. And I think we fought it on behalf of the whole industry. Now, to your question, I'll let Stu comment on this, but the last few months prior to getting sued, as well as the last month's pre-decision, were both stressful times, and kind of, do we have the conviction, the resources to fight that fight?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, when I look at social media and when they talk about the case, they get most of it right. One thing that they consistently got wrong is they always predicted that a settlement was a week away or 2 weeks away. We always been clear, and we were clear with the SEC before they sued us. After they sued us, we really didn't, discuss settlement much. This case could have settled and always would have settled if the SEC would have acknowledged that the digital asset XRP is not in and of itself a security. And they didn't want to give that up. And they didn't want to give that up because they're pursuing this regulation by enforcement, this policy goal that there's something in the law called a crypto asset security, and there's nothing in the law that constitutes a crypto asset security. And that's what this fight was about, and that's what we won. And we won it, as Brad said, not only on our own behalf, but on behalf of the entire industry.
And just to back up a little bit, because I think I've spent more time with the Howey test than, and I'm not even involved, I'm not embroiled in a lawsuit here. And I think most people, the fact that an entire industry of technologists knows what the Howey test is based on a 1940s Supreme Court case concerning orange groves, that in and of itself is a sign that there's something that needs to be fixed in DC. But I think for those that have not been in the inner workings here, the SEC basically argued that the issuance of XRP was a security, but then like these tokens are also securities just by their nature. So they were created and now they are subject to registration and all these transfer restrictions that would basically render unusable pretty much any asset that the SEC came after. And now at least there is a precedent that is going to allow much smaller firms that don't have $100 million to spend on this fight to make their case, or at least start with the upper hand and kind of put the burden of proof on the SEC and the government. I assume that you're not surprised that they didn't just roll over and accept the decision, but we talked about the 3 months before. What's the 3 months after this decision look like, and where do you envision this going? Because just based on what we know about certain individual that's at the helm of the SEC, it doesn't seem like he's going to change his tune until his term expires.
I'll comment at the beginning here. Look, I think between the decision the judge made about the Ripple case, as well as more recently the Grayscale case, the federal government, you have judges in the federal government describing the SEC's behavior, and these are quotes, as arbitrary and capricious.
Just sounds great.
In the Ripple case, there was a judge's decision who said in a written decision that the SEC is not following, quote, a faithful allegiance to the law. Like, these are damning statements.
There was one other line in there. It's like, basically this doesn't make any sense. For lack of a better term, those,
And so what I find most surprising, kind of to your question, so now we have two, really credibility eroding events to a U.S. institution in the SEC. And then you have Gary Gensler, the chair, went before Congress last week. This is, I think, last Wednesday, and he doubled down. It's almost like, okay, we're going to ignore everything that's happening out here. We're going to ignore that we've been called arbitrary. We're going to ignore we've been called capricious. And we're going to continue to say they're all securities. They're all centralized. And it's almost just like this, a Twilight Zone moment of what is going on? Like, what's he having for breakfast that I'm not? Because in the real world that I'm living in,
whatever Elizabeth Warren's put in his Cheerios, so.
But the real world I'm living in, the judges, and thankfully we have a judicial process. It can be slow, and it took 3 years and well over $100 million. But look, we got to a better outcome, and I think that's going to be an important, as you said, precedent for the whole industry.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about the Howey test. I think what our case exposed is the SEC was never really applying the Howey test. And in their prior cases, look, they settle a lot of cases and they like to wave those around as victories. Those aren't victories. That's just, they have too much leverage and people can't afford to fight them, so they pocket that. But when challenged on the Howey test, the SEC was exposed that if you want to faithfully apply the Howey test to real world facts, you're not going to win. And I think they were shocked that they lost. And what the judge said, look, speculation is not investment. A common interest is not a common enterprise. For there to be an investment money, there actually has to be an investment of money. So if you're using crypto to pay compensation for charitable contributions, for developer grants, there's no investment. So all of taking them through the elements of Howey, they're exposed and they don't win. And this whole concept that the asset itself can be an investment contract and therefore a security doesn't hold water when you actually faithfully apply the law.
I want to add one thing to this, because I think one of the first things Stu said there was really important. Gary Gensler goes out and says that they are winning these cases. The only cases they basically only lost cases because a settlement.
Anyone that takes the case wins.
Right, exactly. If a settlement is not a victory, a settlement is a bully who comes in and says, you will yield to me or I am going to do these things. Not many people had the conviction and resources to stand up to him. I absolutely applaud Grayscale. Look, I know Brian Armstrong's on stage tomorrow. Coinbase is fighting the good fight. And you have to stand up to a bully. And I think as Stu's describing, when you stand up to them, they're losing. He'll say, if he would accept your invitation to come on stage, he would say, look, they're winning and they're doing these things. Like, no, you're not. You're bullying people into submission.
I think we have a prediction market that I'm going to get subpoenaed on stage at some point. But good luck. I mean, I'm spicy on Twitter, but I keep out of trouble otherwise. But I think what I'm interested in kind of in the next 15 months is, to me, like one of the dirtiest words in crypto is engagement, because it's always in the context of like, we need to engage with policymakers, we need to go down, we need to be better at engagement and blah, 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 blah. And I know a lot of people are working their asses off to make that so. What has the dynamic been like for you guys? Because you're very active in DC. You spend a lot of time investing in engagement and trying to help people understand why this industry exists, why it should, and to be in a position where you're trying to have those conversations in parallel with spending $100 million suing the government or battling the government in court, they don't like that. right? Not for the most part, a lot of folks in DC don't like when you fight back. Spoiler alert. So how do you manage that in terms of either having productive conversations with other regulators or having productive conversations with policymakers that might be, persuaded by the SEC's arguments and think that, you're basically, using bad money to fight the government and just get away with it?
Well, look, I'm going to question the premise. Actually, Stu and I were in Washington, D.C. yesterday and met with a whole bunch of people. One of the things we hear consistently is how many of our elected officials think the SEC is overreaching.
Yes.
They think Gary Gensler is not following a faithful allegiance to the law. And
not just Republicans either.
No, it isn't just Republicans. And this should be a fully bipartisan issue.
Yes.
Like, this is not about R's or D's. This is about what does the law say? And as Stu articulated, are they actually following that? What I think the SEC, and I'll say Gary Gensler particularly, he's pursuing power. He's pursuing politics.
Yeah.
He's not pursuing sound policy. And I think we have a lot of elected officials that we've been thanked for fighting the SEC.
Yeah.
Look, there were even elected officials who tweeted after.
Even I have thanked you for fighting the SEC.
That's a rare event. That is a rare event. But look, even elected officials, when we won the case, elected officials tweeted out, this is awesome, this is amazing.
Yep.
And it's because I think they see agencies who are overstepping, who are bullying companies into submission. And so, anyway, I'm kind of questioning the premise of I think yesterday particularly, because this is the first time I'd been there since we'd won the case, that we were very welcomed and kind of thanked for kind of fighting that fight. And look, I think that the tide has turned, and I think more judges are going to see that other judges are challenging the SEC's dominance, if you will, and we've given permission for people to go fight the fight. Here's the roadmap. Even Coinbase, which again I give them huge credit, but you look at it, they're following the Ripple roadmap of here's how to win the case against the SEC.
I think it's interesting that you corrected yourself. I do this all the time, and people just think that I'm obsessed with Gensler. I just wanted to call attention to it. Now everybody knows kind of who he is. But you corrected yourself and you said, well, not the SEC, Gary Gensler. And I think that's important because sometimes people hear the complaints and they're like, oh, it's just the kids at the kid table bitching that now they're being expected to sit with good table manners. And I think that criticism usually it makes its way into the press and they're basically spoon-fed whatever the party in power says, and whatever the government says. But I do think that he is so far out on an island right now, personally, with his agenda, that there are other folks, you see the dissents coming in left and right from two of the sitting commissioners. There does seem to be a pretty clean split between Gensler and his leadership and the rest of the SEC, whose mission to protect investors, promote capital formation, make sure markets are fair and efficient. No one in this room disagrees with that. That's good if the regulator actually abides by that mission. Stu, question for you. In light of that, can you engage with the SEC, or are you just in this perpetual holding pattern, right? Can you basically have conversations with some wings of the SEC, but then fight them in court over here? What does that relationship look like? Because you can't just not have a relationship with one of the key financial regulators.
Yeah. So look, I think under this leadership, under Gary Gensler, our engagement with the SEC is going to be through the litigation and through the court process, unfortunately. Look, the way I was raised as a lawyer, and I practiced here, in New York City for my entire career until I joined Ripple, the way I was raised and the way I was taught is you don't fight the regulator. And the regulator's going to push hard. The regulator's going to use all the leverage that they can. They'll take it right up to the line, but they won't cross the line. With this administration, they've crossed the line. Everything that Brad talked about earlier, no faithful allegiance to the law, acting arbitrarily and capriciously. And we have the legal precedent that we created, which is very important for other litigants who are facing the SEC in this space. But from a policy perspective, what we're starting to hear now is the recognition from policy, from congressmen and senators, that the SEC is not infallible. That when Gary Gensler spews his talking points, that they can now question them because he's lost. And you may not see that at the top. Maybe you see that some of the hearings, some of the you'll see some of the senators sitting hard, but behind the scenes, it's like, Gary, what you've been telling us for the past 2.5, 3 years, it doesn't appear to be true, and there's a huge value to that.
Not only does it not appear to be true, but to your point, Brad, if you read the opinions, they're not split decisions.
No,
they're scathing.
The Coinbase, there's been some early skirmishes with Coinbase. I mean, that judge is calling bullshit on the SEC. It's just like, wow.
An Obama appointed judge too, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, by the way, again, this isn't a D versus R thing. It's a broad recognition. Look, there's one thing that I would add to what Stu said. I was in Asia last week also, and I was asked by entrepreneurs privately, like, advice. How do you handle this? Do not assume they are a ethical actor. It's kind of the come in and register, come in and talk to us. We came in, we were transparent. I went in, the first 2 meetings I had, there were no lawyers in the room. They used that information, and they're not.
That was before Stu was on your team to tell you differently.
That actually is true.
Right?
Well, I interviewed him the day that one of the days that I was meeting with the SEC. But anyway, that was a long time ago. Look, you have to kind of go in with the assumption that they are not good actors, which is a really, really sad reality, because that's not how I went in. I'm kind of like, look, we have nothing to hide. We're being totally transparent about what we're doing. We have lots of meetings. It's like, I'm telling you what I'm doing for years, and then you sue me years later saying what I was doing was not okay when you didn't tell me that. It's just like that. The sad thing for me as a US citizen is it erodes credibility and confidence in the system. They're supposed to be helping, to your point, the mission of protect investors, orderly markets. I can't remember the third one, but like, what happened? In our case, you had 75,000 people.
No one can remember the third one. It's capital formation. That's the reason that New York is the epicenter of the financial world, and we don't do fucking capital formation anymore in this country. So,
but
anyway,
the other thing
I'll save that for my fireside at the end of the day with Vivek.
The other thing we're talking about is the Gary Gensler of the SEC, and one thing we can't lose here is that under this administration, there's real institutional and reputational damage being done to the Securities and Exchange Commission. And there's a lot of good faith actors that work in the SEC. There's a lot of full-time employees, not political appointees. But when Gary goes, the damage that he has done to this organization is going to last for years and years. And I think we've given permission not only to our industry, but to TradFi, that they can challenge the SEC.
And there are other challenges now that are somewhat, Virtu, right, is one. I think there's a few other kind of active.
So we really, you saw this sporadically in years past, but now you're seeing it. So this Gary, so I guess the message is, if you're at the SEC and you're a good faith actor, I mean, you realize that when Gary goes, you're just not going to be able to fix the damage that he has done to this organization. He's done real institutional and fundamental damage to the credibility of this commission.
I think it's time well spent to cover this, because it's light at the end of the tunnel, knowing that he's probably not going to be there forever, and he's already taking some L's. But at the risk of turning this into a Gary Gensler derangement syndrome panel, I want to pivot to Asia, because you just made some news last week saying Ripple is going to move 80% of its operations overseas. Is that an accurate description?
Well, what I said is accurate is 80% of our hiring, so we have continued to hire. 80% of our hiring is non-US.
Yes.
Some of that's Singapore. I mean, the big epicenters.
They're not moving, but just all the growth is happening overseas.
Some people have moved. We've had, and one of my direct reports moved to London recently. I mean, look, the reality is, you want to invest where the rules are clear. We're hiring in Dubai. We're hiring in Singapore. We're hiring in London. We're hiring in Switzerland.
You're telling me you don't want to invest $100 million in Stu's team and his friends to expand into one more jurisdiction?
Every dollar I've invested in Stu's team is paid off. So I'm happy to invest in Stu's team. But look, it's just all investors want to invest, and I mean investors meaning employees or capital, where the rules are clear. I think the vast majority of the people in this room and the people in the industry, we want to follow the rules, but you can't be arbitrary and capricious about what the rules are.
And Brad's had this experience, I've had this experience. Brad and I were in Asia last week, but as we traveled the world and we talked with regulators, early on in those discussions, when the SEC first sued us, we would open up the discussion and say, let me talk about the SEC. We quickly learned they don't care. They don't want to talk about the SEC. They've got their frameworks, and that's what they care about, and they're not even raising. So the SEC, what they're doing here has become so bespoke to where the rest of the industry and the rest of the world is moving in terms of rational regulatory frameworks that protect consumers, protect the integrity of the market, keep bad actors out, but facilitate the innovation. That's where the rest of the mature economic centers are moving. US is an outlier.
Stu, after you've won the rest of the legal battles, you're going to get bored?
Am I what?
Are you going to be bored?
We'll see. Who knows?
Do we get you confirmed as a commissioner?
I love that idea. Although I keep Stu busy with other things, unfortunately, but I'm not sure board would be the answer. But I mean, look, I'll build on something you just said. We need people from industry to actually be willing to engage and go into that, to be a regulator.
Yep.
I don't know if that's Stu Alderoty. I'm not interested, but look, we are going to continue to engage around the world. We certainly were doing that last week, and what we find time and time again is that non-U.S., and we spend a lot of time, because we're here in the U.S., talking about the U.S. regulatory environment. We're growing really fast.
You're talking about your business in every other conference, I'd imagine.
Yeah, exactly. Like I mean, yes, people ask, is the lawsuit, and it's momentous for the industry. But look, at the end of the day, outside the United States, and I have employees who work at Ripple who make fun of me because I'll go into a meeting, as Stu said, and I'll talk about the SEC, and be like, nobody gives a shit. Like, it's just that in that country where we're operating, they're happy to engage. Ripple's business grew quickly during the SEC lawsuit. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about, we had 7 minutes left. We've covered a lot of legal territory. Let's talk about the business and kind of where things are right now. I think when people that are not your customers in financial services think about Ripple, all they think about is XRP SEC, right?
XRP and what?
SEC.
Oh, SEC.
Yeah, right. Like that. Those are probably the two three-letter associations that people will have with Ripple. How is business going internationally, where you don't have these distractions, and kind of what are you guys most excited about right now? What's getting some traction?
Yeah. Look, for us, we were worried. The first quarter after the SEC sued us was, frankly, kind of a dark time. I think my mic go out?
I think it went out.
All right, not sure. Oh,
it's coming in and out.
So. Not sure why.
Maybe just lean forward, yeah.
Yeah, all right. Okay, so right after the SEC sued us was kind of a tough time for Ripple because, a lot of employees were kind of like, what does this mean? Certainly customers were nervous about. What we found happen, as Stu described, is outside the US, people leaned in. We were solving a clear problem, and primarily around cross-border payments, fast, inexpensive settlement, removing the need to pre-fund accounts, which happens in cross-border settlement, is a big selling proposition. So the business grew very quickly. We're doing billions of dollars a year in transactions through regulated financial institutions. This year, I think that the highlight has been we're expanding our product suite. We did one acquisition we've closed of a Swiss-based company called Medico, doing institutional infrastructure for the custody of digital assets. They have a bunch of tier 1 banks as customers. Just within the last week or two, we announced the intent to acquire another custody company called Fortress Trust.
Hey, you bailed out a Bitcoin company.
Yeah, it's funny how we take bullets from people. And it's like, we're making people whole that might have lost some funds, and then they're like, well, we're going to move our funds. You're like, okay, whatever, don't care. But look, I think Ripple has continued to focus on what's the problem we're solving, who's the customer, and let all the noise and all those things play out as it will.
Are you concerned about competition increasing from within the industry? So we just had a good conversation with Jeremy. There's been a lot of infrastructure developments, the UX around stable coins and value settlements. I think on the layer ones, it used to be much more expensive than anything that you could do, kind of using the XRP network. That gap is closing, and there's arguably a lot more integration paths with things like Ethereum and all the infrastructure on top. How do you view the XRP network versus these, growing, and arguably, kind of deeper networks that have some of these network effects?
Look, I think that the business that Circle is building, I'm impressed with. I think Jeremy's done a great job. I don't view the industry as my competition. And he kind of said this on stage a bit ago, and I totally agree with it. I'm going to hammer it home, including to you. We should not be beating on each other inside crypto. The opportunity is the multi-trillion-dollar financial system, which can benefit from these technologies in terms of transparency and speed and cost. And I think one of the biggest problems, even here in Washington, not here, meaning the US, Washington, is that we're not even a cohesive voice in Washington as an industry. And there continues to be this petty infighting of again, somebody saying they're going to stop using Fortress Trust because Ripple owns it. What's the matter with you? I don't, it's just, I try not to pay attention to it, but I think, and I give you credit because I think, going back a year, the boxing gloves being up, you're we got to come together. We can disagree on stuff, that's fine. But so much of the problem isn't...
Well, you've heard that phrase, me versus my brother, me and my brothers versus my cousins, me and my brothers and my cousins versus the barbarians at the gates, right? So it's, we're at the barbarians at the gate moment, and I think more people are coming to that realization, or they should, especially, when folks like you guys notch, legal victories of such importance.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think a lot of voices have coalesced around that. I think the legal victory helps. I frankly think it puts Ripple in a position to try to bring people together even more. When we went to Washington yesterday, that was part of our message. We weren't in Washington fighting for Ripple yesterday. We're in Washington fighting for crypto. And we're not fighting against what Circle's doing. We're not fighting against, I want to support those things. I think the addressable market is so big. If we're fighting about who has what percentage of the market today, you've totally lost the plot. And the market is going to be huge. We need to keep growing the whole market. If Circle wins a little bit more, or Ripple wins a little bit more, we both can win a lot.
I want to give Stu the last question because it's the reason, and you said this is the first time you guys have done something on stage together. And I wanted to end with this question because I think there's a reason that we wanted to do this, the three of us. You don't win this court case if you don't sign off on that massive expenditure, and Stu doesn't advise you on how you can win. So Stu, how would you advise? Because you're in the driver's seat in the courtroom, but not necessarily in the decision to take it the distance. So what advice would you give other CLOs, heads of legal, that are working with entrepreneurs when really your first instinct is protect the company, right? But they might need to develop a little courage or kind of make a hard decision on when to fight. How would you advise other folks in the industry to navigate that? Because it's not a foregone conclusion that most people are going to stand up and fight unless both people are on the same page.
So I think this is a really important point, and it's a point that I think a lot of people forget. When the SEC sued Ripple 2 or 3 days before Christmas in 2020, they sued Ripple, they sued Brad Garlinghouse individually and Chris Larson, our chairman and our founder, individually. And they did that to bring massive pressure on the company and Brad and Chris. And Brad and Chris showed tremendous fortitude and courage to say, we're not going to fold to that pressure. Pursuing their personal interests, the best thing they could have done was settled and just finished it and said, look, I'm not going to put my personal livelihood and reputation at stake. They didn't. And it was that message that they sent to the company. It was that message that they sent to the industry on day one that really was the wind at our backs to win this case and to fight hard and to win this case. So the message is what we talked about earlier, is when you walk into that SEC building, they're not your friend, concede nothing. You're not walking into a church. You don't have to bow down. You could be respectful, but the fix is in. They're not a regulatory body under this administration. They're a law enforcement agency, and they're looking to prosecute. But they're looking to prosecute not like the DOJ, because the DOJ, when they seek to prosecute you, they have to give you all of the information that they have, all of the exculpatory evidence, anything that could help prove your innocence. The SEC does just the opposite. They give you nothing, and they ask for everything. And that's a very dangerous game to play. And the way we used to play it in the old days is if we cooperate, we're going to get cooperation credit. No cooperation credit. So be strong, have fortitude, recognize that they're not infallible. In fact, they are fallible, and if you believe you're right, you probably are right, so it's okay to fight them.
Next year
That was a pretty good end cap. That was perfect.
That's why I wanted
exactly. That's perfect.
and the way. Okay, so next year we'll do Rocky 3 after the full and unequivocal defeat of the SEC at the helm of this current regime, and maybe we'll have Commissioner Peirce as the interim chair.
Right, let's get Gensler.
What's that?
Let's get Gensler up here.
I was saying maybe have her sitting in the chair, not
that
chair, the chair.
Yeah, the chair. Yeah,
But yes,
sorry, yes.
we'll
Chairperson
always
of the SEC.
Always an open invitation for my very dear family friend Gary Gensler. So, but on that note, thank you, Brad, Stu, fighting the good fight.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thanks for having us.